Hi, I'm Dr. Dan Ratner, and on Crushing Doubt, we often bring on some of the greatest minds in the mind-body field. Today we have Georgie Oldfield. She is a physiotherapist in the UK. That's the equivalent of a physical therapist in the United States. And she has a lot of great things to say, and we have some overlap that is surprising, as is often the case when I bring guests on. If you haven't already, click subscribe and ring the bell for notifications, and put your comments below. I want to hear from you about what it is that you need to hear and what you're responding to. I'm here with Georgie Oldfield. She is a physiotherapist from the UK. I have finally figured out that what that means is it's the equivalent of a physical therapist here in the US. She's the author of Chronic Pain, Your Key to Recovery. It's one of the great books in the TMS mind-body field. Many people have gotten help from this. Georgie, I hear great things about you all the time, but we're basically meeting for the first time today, which is very exciting. You're also the creator of SIRPA, which is Stress Illness Recovery Practitioners Association. And one of the reasons I find you so fascinating and I'm excited to talk to you is that you do seem to have an eye towards training other people in this and kind of spreading the word. And that's kind of like me, because this podcast is partly about spreading the word. And ultimately I'm setting up a training program now. So this is something I will probably want to pick your brains on. So what I wanted to do first is just get you introduced to our audience in terms of what your experience has been. What brought you into this line of work? I was commenting before that I thought from seeing you we're similar ages. You're a very young looking person. And so you have actually been ahead of me in this process for a while now. So when was it that you discovered Sarno, and can you tell me kind of what went on behind the scenes for you as you thought this all through?
Well, it was back in 2007, and I'd been looking for an answer to so many questions, but patients who'd turn up, and so many people would say, I've woken up with pain, or they had a prolapsed disc that was shown on a scan, but they'd recover completely from my very gentle treatments, or nothing could be found wrong. And you'd be thinking, what on earth is causing this pain? Or they'd be doing something, how they normally would do. People do something they normally do without any problem, and then they develop pain. And it just wasn't making sense. And I was included in this with recurring pains that I had, which got more frequent when I left the National Health Service and set up my own business, especially as my husband's self-employed as well. So it was quite a stressful time, but of course I was pretending outwardly everything's fine, this is wonderful, and not showing how stressed I was. The first clue to me was when I woke up one morning with acute sciatica and could hardly move, and I couldn't put my shoes and socks on for 2 weeks. And I, luckily by then, was beginning to question what was happening, but also I ended up going to see a lady who was the first person ever who said to me, what's going on in your life? And nobody'd ever asked that. I'd never asked that to a patient before. And it suddenly clicked that actually all the stress was relevant. So I began questioning more her and other colleagues, and reading, trying to find an answer. And that's when I came across Dr. Sarno's work and read every book I could, tried to find somebody over in Europe or England or UK who was doing this work, couldn't find anybody. That's why in the end I contacted Dr. Sarno, and I just said, could I come over and shadow him? Now, at first he said no, because he'd never allowed anybody but doctors to come and shadow him and spend some time with him. But he did agree. So November 2007 is when I went over and spent a few days with him and observed the lectures and sat with him and followed him with his patients. And so that was the turning point for me. And I have to admit that right at the beginning, when I read his first book, it was an absolute epiphany for me. It just answered all the questions I had with my patients, with especially the patients with chronic pain, and they get better, they come back, and then they go off again a bit better, then come back, and you think, what is going on with this? Why? And so it was just something that it was like I just needed to answer these questions. And that's why reading his books was just, yay, found the answer.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking, it seems like the commonality that we often have between the people who get into this field, a lot of it is about the fact that we couldn't let the questions just go to rest. We couldn't just say, oh, well, I guess we don't know. I'm often very struck by how some doctors or people in all kinds of fields can just say, oh, we just don't know certain things.
Yes.
I don't get that.
No.
I mean, I understand there may be questions that are hard to answer, but I'm like on a quest for the answers to these questions because
Yes.
I felt the same way as a therapist. I think you'll be interested in this, but I've changed not only my practice to fit with the fact that now I specialize in these particular things, but even my general practice has changed from understanding these things.
I bet.
It's a radical change.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it takes some bravery, I think, to look at your own practice and figure out what am I? So I wonder what that was like for you, that shift.
Oh, huge. And funnily enough, at that point when I went over to America, it was the first time I'd ever traveled on my own. I mean, I'd gone around the UK, but I'd never flown to America on my own before. So that in itself was a big thing. If Dr. Sarno had been in London, it would have been a lot easier. But actually traveling, and to be honest, I have some American cousins, and one of them flew down because we obviously don't see each other very often. One flew down to New York and we spent the first day together. That was great. It was just a matter of, okay, so I knew how to get around New York, for example, before I actually then went to see Dr. Sarno. But yes, it was huge. And then coming back and then thinking, oh my goodness, this is so different. The understanding is so different from my practice and my training as a physical therapist or physiotherapist. That it was quite scary. And I did get in touch with my professional organization, the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy at the time, to sort of explore this with them and check that I was working within my scope of practice, which thankfully I was. But it was one of the things actually is that you need to be trained. There was no training. And so my training came from visiting Dr. Sarno, visiting Dr. Howard Schubiner and staying with him and his wife and shadowing him and going to the conference he organized and going to the next couple of conferences. But it was getting expensive to having all my peer support and training in America. And so that was one of the reasons where I thought, actually, if I train other people, one of the things it does, it gives me more peer support over here. And it helps raise awareness of this work, but it also would stop other people having to go to the extremities that I did to be able to learn more about this. And of course, we never stop learning, do we? I mean, when I look at the past 13 years and how this work has evolved with the pain science and with the work that everybody's doing that is really helping us all develop as practitioners as well. So it's the way I work now is very different from how it was in 2007.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So I've been writing my own book on these things, because I've developed my own way of thinking about it that came from my own recovery, where I got pieces from Sarno, I got pieces from Schubiner, I got pieces from David Schechter, pieces from Eric Sherman. I got pieces from many different places, and actually, even within Sarno, I read Candace Pert, and I was like, wow, there's just amazing information. And what I found is the book that I was writing back then is totally different than the book that I'm writing now, even though I still haven't published it. But it's become the great thing is it's become a better and better book because I'm much more honed, and so. I think you're right with this idea of education never ends. And I guess I want to impart that to the sufferers out there as well, that their learning also doesn't end, and that means that they can keep extending the relief that they can get as they understand more about it.
Absolutely.
So one thing I wanted to ask you about, you did a TED Talk. When was the TED Talk? I'm not recalling.
Last May. May 2019.
Okay. But it feels like years ago, I'm sure, with the pandemic. So I've watched it a couple times, and there were a couple of things that jumped out at me. But one of them is the story of the burglar.
Yeah.
Because, so we'll catch the viewers up to speed. In brief,
Yeah.
Georgie was recently married and saw someone at the foot of her bed, and it wasn't her husband. So because her husband was next to her in bed.
Yeah.
And it really freaked her out. But then it was months later, right? When
4 months later, yes.
Right, your husband was away for the
He
night and was
left
coming
me
back
for the first evening since that night. So this was the first time I'd been on my own in the house, and that was not in the day, but came home late at night. And so he came home, and I just thought, well, I'll go to bed and I'll just wait until I hear him come home. Then I'll go to sleep. And of course, I fell asleep. And the next thing I heard was not the van pulling up the drive, but the bedroom door opening. And I was lying on my tummy, and I can remember it clearly because, of course, big emotions, you remember these things. And I remember lying on my tummy. The door was to my left at the time. And I remember just flicking my head round, seeing it was my husband and thinking, oh, that's okay. It's only my husband. Fell asleep. And then it was in the morning when I woke up, and I just couldn't lift my head off the bed. And I was in absolute agony. I remember literally lifting my head so I could sit up and having to wear a collar for a while because I couldn't even hold my head up. Of course, at that time, I had no idea why. And I'm thinking, well, I must have caused myself whiplash by doing that.
Right. And isn't it amazing how every person convinces themselves of these very illogical things.
Yes.
I've turned my head very quickly thousands and thousands of times in my life. Yep. Never had it happen. And then suddenly, boom, this one time.
Maybe it's the pillow, the pillow that I've slept with for years.
Right. And we start to think, okay, maybe there's cumulative effects. I've been sleeping on this bed all this time and it was fine, but then suddenly it wasn't.
Yes.
One of the things that I often say, I think you'll agree with this pretty heartily, I think that theories that rely on randomness are not good theories. And
really?
Yes. Isn't that weird? But we do this all the time. We do rely on random theories. And that's partly because we're not getting the information that we need. But one of the things that really struck me about what you said, as you thought about it later, as you reprocessed it later, the burglar event, the 4 months later after the burglar event, is that you didn't take the time to process that emotional experience. This happens to me all the time. I'm a very aware person, but I think, okay, I'll think about that. And then I just don't. Yeah. And then I wake up with a symptom or something pops up. So I think we're helping people to recognize with stories like that the importance of processing it. You said that animals, they don't just go to sleep after that.
No.
They don't have the conscious, they don't have that conscious illogic set in where they're like, oh, it was fine. It was months ago. That's not what an animal thinks. They wouldn't
have gone to sleep thinking that they were scared just in case a burglar came into the bedroom.
That's also true.
I had all those thoughts going around in my mind because I was nervous, and obviously not nervous of my husband coming home, but clearly that was there when my husband opened the door, and it was then the shock that there must have been a real triggering of this huge fear within me that what I did was just, oh, it's only Stuart, shut it down and go back to sleep.
Exactly.
Not run it off or shake or whatever.
So one of the things that Sarno talks about is that symptoms are there as a distraction from big emotion. But one of the things that struck me in your TED Talk that very much aligns with some things that I think is that it's really a communication. The body is communicating to us.
Definitely.
And I wanted you to talk a little bit about your view of that, because we are very aligned on that.
Yeah. No, I agree. I do feel, and I talk to my patients and talk to them about it being a signal. There's a signal that something needs addressing, whether there's something we're not dealing with in our life or something that maybe we haven't dealt with, but it's a signal. And if we ignore the whispers, the little aches and pains, then we end up with the body shouting at us to literally, as I heard from somebody today, the body saying no, and that's it. They can't get out of bed. because they've ignored all the little things. And so this, when I have somebody, I'm like trying to explain this, sometimes I'll, if we're, say, encouraging people to use emotional awareness more, that, for example, if people have a migraine, then they will often have an aura or a sensation before that. So that's a good time to actually, okay, that's an indicator something's going on that you're not dealing well with. So deal with it then. Or better still, when you become more emotionally aware, then you can actually deal with the emotion that you didn't deal with, and then it triggered the first sensation. And it took me a while after coming across Dr. Sarno's work, because I think there was less information there about emotional awareness and sensations and signals that there's something to deal with. It took me, I don't know how long, but probably a few years before I resolved my symptoms pretty quickly, but I remember there being the first time where I was aware of an emotion that I wasn't able to deal with in that moment. I was in a hotel foyer. Driving home, I was thinking about it, trying to work out what had pressed the buttons. And I was thinking and not in my body. And I developed heartburn, which was my go-to symptom that I used to live on antacids. And it wasn't until I got home and did the emotional processing that actually just suddenly I had an insight, and then just literally the heartburn went pfft. But it took about 10 minutes of just sitting quietly and doing some emotional awareness work. But that was the first time I was aware of the emotion before the symptom.
This is a great piece of information for my viewers and listeners too, because I get a lot of questions about, well, why am I not getting instantly better so fast? And what you're saying is sometimes it can take years to start to think about it in the right way. You know, I tell people when you're having a physical symptom, think emotionally. And that's what you're describing.
I feel it more like feel emotionally, because where everybody's thinking too much. They're overanalyzing, ruminating, worrying. So I must admit, I don't particularly like that word, think psychologically or think emotionally. It's like feel, because I'm trying to get people out of their heads into their body to actually feel.
No, I know what you mean. The reason I say think emotionally is because, you know, we always have to tailor our words for different people.
Absolutely.
And there are some people who they're so rooted in thinking that I want that first step to be think emotionally.
Yes.
What you're describing ultimately is where you do want to get. Feel emotionally.
Yes.
But so it's so interesting.
Time. It can take people a long time to really get that insight and have that understanding to just let go, because this is what it is, isn't it? About letting go. And not trying to work things out all the time. Sometimes it's not a matter of working it out, but actually allowing ourselves to feel. But it can take people a long time to be able to do that. And I think this is more about a personal development journey. This is not, and all people try to get rid of their pain, they're trying, and trying is like creates resistance. When we let go, it's just letting go. But when you say let go or surrender, people think, well, so you say surrender to the pain, so the pain just takes over, and that's not obviously what we're saying. Right,
that's not what we mean, and but it shows the hopelessness that can set in for people.
Absolutely, understandably.
They're always thinking we're going to end up with somebody telling me you just have to accept it, which is exactly the opposite of what we do.
Yes.
I also I imagine you have seen this in your practice and even in yourself, but I find that the symptoms, they get louder and louder until they're heard. But the interesting thing is after they're heard, those people then become more powerful in their own lives than they ever were before. They're really listening to themselves and what they need. It certainly was true for me.
Yes.
You know, I was a pretty shy kid growing up. I remember we had to do this thing in high school. We had to film this little commercial, and it was like a 2-minute long thing. And I was so self-conscious, and of course I was a teenager at the time. But the idea of being someone who would host a podcast, a video podcast, like that's only something that could have happened after my symptoms, after I felt like I knew me and that connectedness we get with ourselves by taking the body at its word.
Yes, absolutely. And you know what? One thing that somebody said to me many years ago now, I think it was soon after coming across this work, I think before I'd set up SERPA, and I was expressing my fears about moving forward because I was very shy as well as a youngster. And it was, and actually, exactly like you, actually to stand in front of a camera 10 years ago. Oh my God, that was
Right.
far too much. But one thing she said to me when I was expressing my fears of getting out there and what will people think, all the typical TMS personality traits, and what if I'm criticized and they're confronting me. And all she said was, who are you to think that you shouldn't get this work out there? This work's far more important than you. And it was,
Right.
and it was literally like
Yeah.
a slap in the face. And that
Oh,
so helped.
right.
I think, get over yourself, Georgie. This is more important.
Well, that is really ultimately the way that I came to be a good public speaker. I'm giving myself a pat on the back, but it really is. It's partly because I know how hard it was before. It's when you change it to be about the information and not about yourself.
Yes.
It just changes everything.
Yes.
That I'm out here I'm not talking about this because I want people to think about me. I really don't care about that.
No.
I want people to think about this information. And actually, that brings me to one piece of information. I was so excited to hear this in your TED Talk because it's something I've thought about before. So I'm a big sports fan. And when I was growing up, there were not all these surgeries happening. They were much, much more rare. In fact, there's a surgery in baseball I'm sure you're aware of. It's called Tommy John surgery. Tommy John was an active pitcher when I was a kid, and he hadn't had his surgery yet. So there was no Tommy John surgery. And what it is they move a ligament from the leg into the elbow to replace one that's been torn. Well, in your TED Talk, you talk about the fact that we really have not started studying asymptomatic people.
No.
It started in kind of the mid-90s.
Mm-hmm.
So especially if you grew up before then, or even, look, unless you're growing up right now, you're not necessarily aware of this information as much. And as we know, we're trying to spread the word because not enough people have this information anyway.
Absolutely.
But when they started studying asymptomatic people, they saw, the correlation between these structural issues we thought there were is really not there. So you quoted some numbers here. 40% of baseball players had tears in tendons or ligaments in their dominant hand.
Yes.
About close to 50% of basketball players had cartilage tears in their knees.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think, 77% of hockey players had pathological changes in their hips and groin.
Which is incredible. 77%.
77%.
But no pain.
Yeah. But no pain, right? So the if you're going to be a true scientist, you can't ignore data like that.
No.
But we didn't have the data like that before. So I've always thought, after discovering Sarno, I've thought, I don't think this Tommy John surgery makes sense, because here's what I would see all the time. These players would go out there, and if they had a bad performance, they were injured.
Yeah.
So what does this mean? It means that we are thinking that these people are perfect. They will be great performers unless they are injured. And I think we like to think about ourselves that way, but actually it's the opposite, in that if we don't perform well, we might look to explain it with an injury. And we've got all these structural injuries. So from the time you're 20 on, we are deteriorating in ways that are like, I know that sounds morbid and depressing, but it's like you get gray hairs, you get wrinkles, just over time. But these things don't hurt you.
No, quite.
And it's the same thing with the internal body. There's wear and tear. Would you agree with that? It's more your domain than mine, but that's.
Oh, absolutely. And I've seen some fascinating occurrences with people. And, very commonly people have these, sometimes I have people have had loads of tests, MRIs and all sorts of scans, and nothing's found, but they're still in agony because they haven't quite believed it. So they take time to be able to reach that point. And other people, yes, who have some quite significant degeneration, whether it is in the spine or another joint, and yet they end up being able to resolve their pain. But even with one particular person who had no symptoms whatsoever in his hips until a few weeks after he'd had surgery. and surgery for something completely different. And within a few weeks of that, he developed groin pain and then started going into a typical arthritic hip pattern. So losing movement in his hip, as well as developing pain, which ended up with a hip replacement down the line. Now, when he started showing those signs, then I suggested he have an x-ray because the pain wasn't settling. And it showed no cartilage in that hip, but hardly any cartilage in the other hip. But he'd had no pain in either hip until a few weeks before, which gradually got worse. And it wasn't just the pain, but the movement. He lost movement. And so functionally, he was a lot worse. And it was just that was the first time for me to be able to see that and to realize, I mean, that sort of degeneration takes years and years and years to develop. And yet within weeks, suddenly develop pain and a loss of movement.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating. And one of the things that I run into a lot is people seem to want to underestimate the power of the brain. And yes. I find that to be a bit bizarre, given what the brain can actually do.
Yes.
And they'll say, well, can the brain actually make your shoulder hurt? And I'm like, the brain can do all kinds of things. And of course, it's, I mean, I tend to think of the brain as like this whole thing. Our whole body is just basically extended brain.
Yes.
And I wonder why it is that people want to underestimate both the mind and the body. Because another thing you said in the TED Talk is that the body is as good as it's ever been. Evolution is going to keep our bodies getting better and better. So I wonder, do you have thoughts about why do we exist in this mind space where we think of the mind as not powerful over the body and the body as crumbling and not functional? It never made sense to me from an evolutionary standpoint.
No, it doesn't. And I think for me, it comes down to beliefs. If that's what we're taught growing up, then it can be quite challenging to change a belief. But if that's something that we've grown up believing and we're taught it as well, then it's more, and also it's not tangible, is it? You know, it's far easier to say, especially since all the test results started coming, MRIs started coming through and scans and things, other scans, and to be able to see them on the scan, you can understand why people would think, oh, look, you've got pain in your hip. It must be that. Even though frequently through my career, I've seen symptoms blamed on problems found on a hip or another part of the anatomy that doesn't actually fit. Or, yes, you've got a prolapsed disc. That's why you're getting sciatica. But hang on, the signs in the leg, let's say, doesn't fit the actual nerve that's being compressed. So, but it's when you can see it. So I think it's because the mind is so intangible, and the brain is just so challenging to understand.
I also think that people. You're right. These things are not totally illogical that people are thinking. It's just that when we follow the logic, it doesn't pan out.
It doesn't.
And that happens all the time. There's pieces of logic that you do need to follow because it makes potential sense. But the great thing is we have science, we have logic, and we can say to ourselves, when I jerked my head around thousands of times before then, nothing happened. But when I did it that time in the situation related to a burglar, well, maybe there's something there. And it's very opening when we start to think this way. So, Georgie, I would love to keep having these conversations with you if you're willing to come on again.
Of course.
I'd love to have you on again at some point.
Thank you.
But it's a pleasure meeting you and hearing about your work, and always good to find a kindred spirit in this.
Definitely.
Including the fact that you're wanting to train other people, because I think we all run into this in this field, which is people ask me, where did I get my training? I'm like, well, I read a book by Sarno, and then I read lots and lots of books, and then I thought about it for a long time, and then I cured my own pain. My body trained me, I guess, or the whole field trained me. So it's so important, the work you're doing, and I appreciate you. I applaud you, and can't wait to have you on again.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right. We'll see you soon.
Yeah. Thank you.
It was such a pleasure having Georgie on. And, I really love to interact with people in the field, especially ones I've never interacted with before, because I learned something in every single interview or every single interaction, I find something new about the field or about the person. So in the case of Georgie, I was thinking about what I learned in this interview. One of the things that came up is how important processing emotions is. There was that story where she didn't process her emotions too much and went to sleep, and she woke up, and this was months later, and had the pain in her neck. It really does tell you, I do sometimes recommend this, that we process our emotions, that we take the time to stop. It's like being mindful. You could lose your keys if you're not being mindful, but if you say, I sat my keys down here, then you're not going to lose them. It's the same thing with emotions. Try to factor that in when you're having an experience. And I think Georgie's story was so emblematic of that. The other thing that I was struck by, I get surprised by this all the time. I think that in the mind-body field, we all think about things differently. And of course, that's true. But we also have a lot of overlap. One of the overlaps I have with Georgie is that symptoms are not just a distraction from the emotions, but they are a communication. Georgie and I share the view that the body is trying to communicate with us. And if we don't listen to it, it's going to end up screaming at us. And I could not agree more with that about what she said. We also talked about some important things that are just near and dear to me, like people becoming more powerful when they get better. And those themes come up again and again on Crushing Doubt, and they come up when I talk to other people in the mind-body field. So it was nice to talk about that. But there were two other things that Georgie said that I hadn't really heard in other places, so I was really excited to hear about it. One is the idea of surrender. And she was pointing out that a lot of times when people hear surrender, they hear it as like when you're at war and you wave the white flag, when you surrender to the symptoms and give in to them. That's not what she means, and it's not what I mean. What we mean is you have to give in to the fight that you're having with yourself, to not accept that the symptoms do mean something, that they really do, and that you want to pay attention to them and you want to learn what they're saying. I was just having a conversation with somebody I'm working with recently about the idea that when you're not afraid of the symptoms anymore, then all of the things that they do to try to fool you, to try to get you into doubt again, to try to knock you backwards, actually become almost amusing. I know that's hard to say when it comes to chronic pain, but when these pains don't last long, when they have meaning, when you see what it's doing, it does become something that you can, if you can't laugh at it, that's okay, but you can at least not be scared of it. And that's a big deal. And that's what it means to surrender to the experience, is to find out about it, not to give in and say, okay, no more. Then I was totally shocked by this. When I was looking into Georgie and what she did, and I came across her TED Talk, she talked about athletes. I had no idea that she was into that sort of thing, of course, but she is a physiotherapist, so it makes sense in retrospect. But the statistics she gave on athletes rang true in a way that I have not found in interactions with other mind-body practitioners as much. I'm a big sports fan, so I've noticed that athletes are often getting injured in ways that seem to correlate with what's going on in the game. If a pitcher gives up 3 home runs, suddenly they're injured. Well, it's as if we think athletes are perfect and they only mess up when they're hurt. And that's really what we're teaching them to think about themselves. But the great thing is that we've started studying athletes when they are asymptomatic, and we're studying people when they're asymptomatic, when there is no symptom whatsoever. And we notice structural problems on their MRIs and things like that do not correlate to the pain. This is the kind of science we need to carry us forward. And it was a pleasure talking to Georgie about this. I hope to have her on the show again. And thank you for watching. Click subscribe, hit like, and ring the bell for notifications. Sign up for our newsletter on crushingdoubt.org for information on new episodes, or to sign up for my live seminars. For questions you'd like answered, please email info@crushingdoubt.org or put your comments below. I'm here to help you resolve your doubts on your journey and find powerful, peaceful, and happy living.